If your surname is on this list, your family tree does not begin in a modern city or a peaceful farming village. It begins in the frozen limestone river valleys of southern France, a place that witnessed the quietest, most disturbing demographic collapse in human history. 39,000 years ago, an entire species was erased here, not in a great war, but swallowed up in the DNA of the people who survived 12 surnames, 12 bloodlines anchored to the literal ground zero of human assimilation. But you must stay until number 1, because that name holds the darkest genetic secret of the Ice Age. A mathematical termination that proves extinction does not happen with a roar, but with a whisper. The countdown begins with a name born in the shadow of the mountains. It is a word that implies safety and stone walls, but for the people who first walked this terrain, there was no safety to be found. They lived in the bottleneck number 12, Castex. Castex, the name is rooted in the old Gascon word for a fortress, or a castle, and it is shared by the regional variant Castets long before. There were medieval stone walls in the Pyrenees. These high mountain passes were geographic traps. 40,000 years ago, as the climate violently shifted and volcanic winter descended over Europe, isolated bands of Neanderthals retreated into these exact elevated valleys. They were cut off. They lived in fractured groups of 10 to 20 individuals, staring down a brutal, freezing landscape. The ancestors of the Castex line built their fortresses on the very same rock where these ancient humans ran out of margin. The geography that gave this name its meaning is the exact geography where a species was genetically cornered by the cold and the arrival of migrating strangers. If your name is Castex or Castets, your bloodline is anchored to the great mountain bottlenecks of Europe, forged in the places where the ancient world made its final, silent stand. The next name carries a physical marker, a trait written directly into the flesh of its descendants. It sounds like a simple descriptor of color, but it is actually a biological echo of the exact genetic absorption that happened in those ancient French valleys. Number 11. Roux. Roux originating from the Latin word russus, meaning red. This became the old French identifier for someone with red hair, often expanded to the spelling variant Leroux. When modern humans pushed into the territories of the Dordogne, they did not simply replace the Neanderthals who lived there. They absorbed them. Today, roughly 2% of the genome of every non-African person on Earth traces back to this exact collision. Ancient DNA reveals that certain genetic variants tied to pigmentation were already present in Neanderthal populations hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived in Europe. While geneticists debate exactly which modern mutations are direct copies, what is not debated is this: as the isolated Neanderthal bands, vanished pieces of their genetic code were filtered into the surviving human tide. The red hair that defined the original bearers of this surname is an evolutionary ghost. It is a physical manifestation of an ancient intermingling that helped early humans adapt to the dark, freezing winters of the north. If your name is Roux or Leroux, your bloodline carries the visible artifacts of Ground Zero. Your ancestors did not just survive the Ice Age, they inherited the flesh and blood traits of the people who were erased by it. The next name is inextricably tied to the landscape of erasure. It sounds like an empty space, a geographic secret where medieval families lived for centuries, completely unaware of the ghosts buried directly beneath their feet. Number 10. Lascaux. Lascaux, tied to the regional Occitan variant Lacombe. These names translate simply to a hidden valley or a deep, narrow cave. Ground Zero for the Neanderthal collapse was not an open battlefield. It was the limestone caverns of the Vézère Valley in southwestern France. For generations, families bearing this surname farmed the land and grazed their sheep over the rolling hills. Completely ignorant of what lay beneath the soil, it was not until September of 1940 that a group of local teenagers stumbled into the Lascaux caves, revealing the most spectacular prehistoric sanctuary on Earth. But the tragedy of the valley is much older than the paintings. It was in these exact types of hidden hollows that the last scattered groups of ancient humans sought shelter as the modern human tide washed over them. The farming families of this valley unknowingly walked over the graves of an assimilated species for 1,000 years. If your name is Lascaux or Lacombe, your bloodline is bound to the literal earth of Ground Zero. Your ancestors held the high ground over the greatest historical mystery in Europe. If tracing your family back through the darkest, most mysterious corridors of human history is the kind of truth you want to uncover, Make sure you are subscribed to mainstream history books. Leave your stories out. We put them back in the next name. Represents the very mechanism that drove the ancient hunters into the ground. It is a name of civilization, but in the brutal mathematics of survival, civilization is just another word for displacement. Number 9. Delmas. Delmas bundled. With the incredibly famous Occitan variant Dumas, this name originates from the old Provençal word mas, meaning a farmhouse or an agricultural estate. The ancient humans, who ruled Ice Age Europe, were apex predators. They hunted immense beasts at close range with thrusting spears, but they required vast territories and thousands of calories a day just to survive the cold. The DNA erasure was finalized not by weapons, but by numbers. When modern humans arrived and multiplied, they brought a different way of extracting life from the earth. A demographic explosion that eventually led to the clearing of land and the birth of agriculture. The first scattered farmhouses represented the taming of the wild. Every acre claimed pushed the carrying capacity of the land in favor of the newcomers. The ancient bands, already genetically compromised and hovering at just 10 to 20 individuals, simply ran out of space. They did not fall to spectacular violence. They fell to the relentless expansion of a new way of life. From this lineage of survivors came a man who knew exactly how to weave history, vengeance, and survival into legendary tales. The author of The Count of Monte Cristo, Alexandre Dumas. Your name is Delmas, or Dumas. Your bloodline represents the demographic tide that conquered the earth. Your ancestors did not just survive the Ice Age, they built the world that replaced it. The next name is quite literally carved from the landscape of survival. It sounds like a common everyday foundation, but it is deeply tied to the ancient technology that once kept humanity from freezing to death. Number 8. Peyre. Peyre, rooted in the old Occitan word for rock or stone, and intrinsically linked to the universal French variant, Pierre. The families who carried this name through the Middle Ages pulled limestone from the earth to build their homes, but they were not the first to shake the stones of southern France. Ground Zero is famous for the Mousterian tool industry, a highly advanced method of flint knapping. Developed by Neanderthals for hundreds of millennia, they pulled flint from the riverbeds of the Vézère Valley to craft lethal specialized blades. They were not brutes, they were master engineers of stone capable of bringing down massive Ice Age bison head-on. The ancestors of the Peyre lineage walked the exact same riverbanks, handling the exact same rocks, living on a terrain defined by its sharp, unyielding geology. Your name is Peyre, or Pierre. Your bloodline is born of the stone of the Vézère Valley. Your ancestors were anchored to a landscape where the right piece of flint was the only thing standing between survival and extinction. The next surname takes that mastery of the environment one step further. It sounds like a simple medieval trade, but it traces the exact evolutionary leap that allowed one species to outcompete another. Number 7. Fabre. Fabre, originating from the Latin word for a smith or craftsman. This Occitan name is bundled with the northern French variant Lefevre. The ancient Neanderthals were masters of stone. The modern human tide brought something new to the frozen caves of Europe. They brought a technological leap. They crafted bone needles to sew tailored airtight clothing. They built complex multi-part projectile weapons to hunt from a distance as the volcanic winter deepened. 39,000 years ago, this asymmetry in craftsmanship became fatal. The ancient bands were powerful, engineered for raw physical endurance, but the newly arrived humans were adaptable. They crafted their way out of the cold. The slow demographic unraveling of the Neanderthals was accelerated by this precise shift in technology, a shift from raw strength to specialized cunning. If your name is Fabre or Lefevre, your bloodline is defined by the cunning of the craftsman. Your ancestors did not just weather the brutal storms of history, they forged the tools to conquer them. Next surname sounds like a peaceful stroll through nature, but it represents the very climate shift that sailed the fate of the Ice Age world. Number 6. Bosc. Bosc, rooted in the old Occitan word for woods or forest. This name is deeply connected to its famous northern French variant, Dubois. The brutal grip of the Ice Age finally began to break the landscape of southern France, underwent a violent transformation. The vast frozen mammoth steppes, thawed, and dense dark forests rapidly reclaimed the valleys. This was a death sentence for the ancient hunters. Neanderthals were ambush predators, heavily built, requiring enormous calories and adapted for very specific close-quarters hunting on the open steppe. As the megafauna died off and the timberline swallowed the hunting grounds, they could not adapt fast enough. Modern humans, however, thrived in the encroaching timber. The families who later took the name Bosc or Dubois claimed their identity from these new, terrifying and resource-rich woodlands that literally grew over the graves of the old world. If your name is Bosc or Dubois, your bloodline survived the great climate shift. Your ancestors mastered the wild that conquered the ice. We are pushing deeper into the valleys of ground zero, and we are closing in on the absolute darkest secret of the assimilation, coming up a name tethered to the literal rock shelters, where the two human species overlapped. But stay right here, because the very next name reveals the brutal mathematics of survival that erased an entire species. It is a name that sounds like a medical necessity, and in the frozen ancient world, it was the only currency that mattered. Number 5. Vidal. Vidal, originating from the Latin word vitalis, meaning life or vitality, most disturbing secret extracted from Neanderthal DNA, is the terrifying reality of their isolation. The ancient tribes were operating at the absolute edge of biological viability. Genetic data proves their breeding populations had dwindled to just 10 to 20 individuals. To survive in that state across vast freezing distances requires an immense, almost impossible spark of vitality. In a gene pool that small, a single harsh winter, one failed hunt, or the loss of a single reproductive female was not just a tragedy, it was a mathematical termination. The Vidal surname carries the essence of this desperate struggle. In a landscape where an entire species simply ran out of life force, the ancestors of this lineage multiplied. They expanded. They possessed the sheer biological endurance to push through the bottleneck. If your name is Vidal, your bloodline is the definition of endurance. Your ancestors possess the sheer vitality required to defy genetic erasure. The next name marks a literal line in the earth. It is a word used to divide property, but in the deep history of these valleys, it represented the invisible and terrifying border between two colliding worlds. Number 4. Lafitte. Lafitte, rooted in the old Gascon word for a boundary stone or marker, and commonly shared by the variant Fitte. When modern humans pushed into the river valleys of southern France, they did not immediately wipe out the existing inhabitants in a single sweeping conquest. There was a period of overlap. For nearly 5,000 years, the landscape was carved into invisible, deeply tense territories. Ancient Neanderthal bands, their numbers already collapsing, held onto their shrinking hunting grounds. Staring across the freezing valleys at the fires of the newcomers, the boundary stones that later gave the Lafitte family their name echo the very concept of these ancient frontiers, the invisible lines where one human species stopped and another began. As the modern human population swelled, those boundaries were constantly pushed, steadily squeezing the ancient bands out of existence. If your name is Lafitte or Fitte, your bloodline stands on the edge of two worlds. Your ancestors claimed the boundaries where the history of humanity was fractured. Forever, the next surname takes us off the open borders and plunges us directly into the earth itself. It is a name that sounds like an empty void, but it describes the exact physical structures where the final acts of the Ice Age tragedy played out. Number 3. Cros. Cros, originating from the old Occitan word for a hollow or a cave, and bundled with the noble variant Ducros. The limestone cliffs of the Dordogne region are completely riddled with rock shelters, shallow, open-faced caves that provided the only true refuge from the punishing cold of the volcanic winter. These hollows were the living rooms and the graveyards of the ancient worlders. The Neanderthal population fractured and dispersed. These shelters became their final sanctuaries. Decades of archaeological excavation in these specific hollows have pulled up the bones of both species. Sometimes separated by mere inches of packed dirt, you can read the timeline of the erasure right there in the soil. The Mousterian stone tools suddenly replaced by the bone needles of the modern humans. The families who later adopted this surname lived their entire lives in the shadow of these massive limestone overhangs. If your name is Cros or Ducros, your bloodline holds the geography of human origins. Your ancestors took their identity from the very shelters that witnessed the end of one species and the rise of another. The next name strips away the shelter of the forest and the protection of the cave. It leaves nothing but the raw, exposed earth, the most unforgiving terrain in the south. Number 2. Garrigue. Garrigue, rooted in the old Occitan word for a barren expanse of limestone scrubland. This is the harsh, rocky, windswept terrain that covers the lower elevations of southern France. While the river valleys offered water and the deep caves offered shelter, the Garrigue offered absolutely nothing. It was a brutal, resource-starved landscape, and it perfectly mirrors the terrifying reality of the ancient collapse. When your entire regional population consists of scattered groups of 10 to 20 individuals, you cannot afford a single mistake. There is zero margin for error. The Garrigue is the kind of landscape that punishes weakness instantly. As modern humans claimed the fertile valleys and the timber-rich forests, the remaining ancient bands were steadily pushed into the margins, the barren scrublands where survival was a daily agonizing math equation. Historical record suggests they did not die out in a glorious romanticized final battle. They died quietly, of starvation, isolation, and exposure. Scattered across the harsh rocky scrublands that later gave this family its name, if your name is Garrigue, your bloodline was forged in the cruelest landscapes of southern France. Your ancestors possessed the resilience to extract life from the barren rock where an entire species met its bitter end. We have reached the final name. It sounds like a place of quiet, medieval prayer, but it sits directly on top of the most profound and disturbing genetic revelation in modern science. This is the name that holds the ultimate secret of the erasure number 1, Moustier. Moustier, rooted in the old French word for a monastery, and heavily bundled with the variants Desmoustier and Dumoustier. For centuries, religious men sought isolation in the Dordogne Valley, building their stone sanctuaries directly into the cliffs, but they had no idea what was buried beneath their feet. One of these exact sites, Moustier, gave its name to the entire technological era of the Neanderthals. The Mousterian, it is the definitive ground zero, and it is here that ancient DNA finally answered the darkest question of the Ice Age. How does an entire species vanish without a massive bloody war? The answer was hidden inside the women when geneticists extracted DNA from the bones found in these southern valleys and the caves of the east. They discovered a chilling pattern. In any given Neanderthal group, the men were all closely related fathers, sons, brothers. They never left, but the women were complete genetic strangers. In a desperate bid to avoid inbreeding, these ancient groups practiced female bias dispersal. The women were moved. They were traded or forced to migrate across hundreds of miles of brutal frozen landscape, integrated into camps of strangers just to keep the bloodlines viable. This social architecture was their undoing. When modern humans arrived in the valleys of southern France, the Neanderthal women were already the ones accustomed to crossing into unfamiliar groups. They were the bridge. They were the ones who were assimilated into the swelling modern human tide. And the mathematics of this are brutally unforgiving. For an isolated Neanderthal band of just 10 to 20 people, losing even 1 or 2 reproductive females to a modern human camp was an absolute unrecoverable death sentence. The men simply ran out of women. They died off in their isolated rock shelters, taking their Y chromosomes into oblivion. The women survived within the modern human groups, passing down fragments of nuclear DNA that still live inside your immune system today, even as their ancient maternal lineages were slowly washed away by the sheer volume of modern human blood. It was not a slaughter, it was a genetic absorption. If your name is Moustier, Desmoustier, or Dumoustier, your bloodline is tethered to the greatest genetic mystery in human history. Your name holds the ground where the maternal lines of an entire species were quietly, mathematically erased. 12 surnames, 12 clans, 12 corridors, leading back through the darkest, coldest valleys of human history. Some began with a mountain fortress, some with a genetic ghost of red hair. A hidden cave, an encroaching forest, or the brutal windswept rock of the scrubland. Your name is not just a name, it is a clan. It is a territory, it is a biological record of survival against impossible odds. Drop your surname in the comments and tell me which clan or valley your bloodline comes from. And if you know the story your family carried out of the ancient world, say it. Those stories deserve to be heard. Make sure you are subscribed. The next video is already waiting for you.